welcome Zach Oakes, who has come here all the way from Charleston, South Carolina, and wants to tell us about writing Clojure at runtime with Nightlight.
All right. Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm Zach. Some of you already learned that last night. And this is writing Clojure at runtime with Nightlight by this guy. Enjoy your nightmares tonight, because that face is going to be in them. Yeah, so I've only given one talk before, and that was a couple years ago at the Clojure Conj. I talked about game development. Did anyone see it at all? Nice, I got groupies. Yeah, and that was a couple years ago, and today I'm going to talk about my other unhealthy obsession, and that is making developer tools. And before I get into that, I'm going to briefly talk about my favorite subject. And I've been doing Clojure for about 5 years now. It's weird to think about, 5 years. And yeah, most recently I lived in Charleston, South Carolina. And professionally, I was a teacher. I taught programming to people of all ages. And that's actually how I got into developer tools, got into making them. When I started teaching, I was teaching coding to kids. And I remember pretty vividly, early on, I was trying to use pretty standard developer tools like Eclipse. And I remember I had this one kid who was just struggling hardcore. And I'm sitting there doubting myself. I was like, man, either I'm a bad teacher or this kid is really stupid. And both of those could be true, but let me suggest a third possibility, which is that, especially with programming, tooling is very important to the learning process, or at least it can get in the way very easily. And when you're using these tools that are made for advanced programmers, and you're trying to teach a beginner, it can very easily be problematic. So I decided, all right, I'll start making some developer tools that target beginners. I've made several that you may have seen or heard of before. And I'm not actually going to talk about these today. I still do maintain them a little bit, but they are some of my older projects. A couple years ago, I started making a new line of products, so to speak. And the reason why is because something happened to me a couple years ago. And I'm making it sound more ominous than it really is, but something happened to me. I came across a new programming language, which I actually got more excited about than Clojure. In fact, I'm sorry to say at this point, I write in this language more than I write in Clojure. Some of you may have heard of it. ClojureScript. And I don't know why it took me so long to start using it, but let me tell you, this whole World Wide Web thing is really going places. Like if you haven't tried it, you really should, because it's, and the reason I really started using ClojureScript pretty hardcore was because if you think about it, yeah, these tools are fairly easy, but you still have to download and install them, and there's system requirements. With the web, there's no such thing. You just point your browser to a URL, and you're there. And for making developer tools, I figured this would make it even easier for people to get started. And so I did that. By the way, I have ClojureScript stickers. If anyone wants one, you just have to ask nicely, and I might give one. Anyway, my first project with ClojureScript, perhaps unsurprisingly, was a text editor. I wanted to make a little browser-based editor. And probably the most popular one now is called CodeMirror. Some of you may have heard of it. If you haven't, you've probably used it because it's everywhere. Like anytime you're on a website with a little editable text area with code in it, it's probably using CodeMirror. And it's quite good. It's got basic syntax highlighting for every language you can imagine. So I decided I'll write my own in Clojure script that has really good support for Clojure syntax. And it's called Paren soup. You can find it online. And it does a lot more than just syntax highlighting. It's got rainbow delimiters. Some of you probably use that in Emacs. It's got these inline reader errors. And it's got a little insta-REPL on the left, kind of like what Light Table had. So it's got a lot of stuff packed in there. For some reason, people are still using CodeMirror. I don't know why. But starting today, you're not allowed to. If you're putting Clojure code in a website and you need it to be editable, you are required to use Paren soup now. In fact, if I catch any of you using CodeMirror when you could be using Paren soup, I may have to open up a can of whoop-ass. And sorry, that's an American expression. I guess that might not be something people say here. So that's Paren soup, and use it if you want. And there is one thing you can't see in this screenshot that is quite important. So when you're using Clojure and you want to edit, you have generally two big options. You can use no editing mode, so you got to complete the parentheses yourself. And you can use paredit, which is an editing mode that completes your parentheses and gives you all these crazy little keyboard shortcuts for managing them. As a teacher, I tried to teach with both. First, I tried with unassisted mode, and you can probably guess the problem. For beginners, they constantly have unmatched delimiter errors, especially when they're cutting and pasting code. They'll constantly run into that. So it was a nightmare. And then I tried to teach them paredit, but like half the lesson, I was just teaching them paredit. Like I didn't have any time left over to teach Clojure. So it was very frustrating. I got to the point where I honestly thought Clojure just isn't right for beginners because the syntax is hard to edit. And then finally, just out of nowhere, we got a third choice called Parinfer. This is an editing mode made by Sean LeBron, and it's great if you haven't tried it. It's basically like it provides a lot of the functionality of paredit, but without ever needing to learn any keyboard shortcuts. And it does that by inferring where to put the parentheses based on indentation. So this is just a simple example of that. And the cool thing is it makes editing Clojure similar to editing Python. It almost turns it into an indentation-based language. So Parinfer is great. And if you're not on the Parinfer train yet, you need to hop on, because that train is leaving the station. And it's not like the U-Bahn where you can just wait 5 minutes and hop on the next train. This is like one of those really cool long-distance trains that we don't really have in the US. And it's like really fast, and you have to buy the ticket in advance, and they've got like staff that are dressed really well and have one of those beverage stations on board. But you probably shouldn't buy the beverage there because it's really expensive. You should just bring your own beverage on the Parinfer train. Sorry, I forgot what I was talking about. Anyway, so if you want to use Paren soup in an actual project, you can use Nightcode, which actually uses Paren soup as its editor. And that's an option. But obviously, for many of you, you're already using Cider or Cursive, and they're much more sophisticated than Nightcode. And that's by design. I never really intended for it to be for really advanced programmers. For example, it doesn't have code completion, which I know a lot of people want, and Nightcode has never had it, and it's like over 3 years old. I never had code completion. People keep asking me for it, and I don't think you realize how hard it is to implement code completion. It's really hard. Cider does it. I don't know if Bojidar is here, but Cider does it by actually running your project, right? And then it creates an nREPL connection and is able to get completion suggestions that way. And I think Cursive does it by actually doing static analysis of all of the code, including all the libraries that your project is using. So both of those are good approaches. I'm not smart enough to do either of them. And this is a lot of work. And so I just decided, well, I'm not going to support code completion. And last year, I started thinking, why is it so hard to implement code completion? And then I had an epiphany in a dream one night. And I don't know why I was dreaming about it, but I had an epiphany that the problem is really the way our editors and IDEs work. You've got this separation. Like on the left, you've got your project running somewhere. And on the right, you've got some kind of an editor, an IDE, like Visual Studio, IntelliJ, Nightcode. I call those the big three. And the problem is they're running in a separate process. And because they're running in a separate process, they have to go through all these complicated machinations to understand your project. And that's why it's complicated. But our tools didn't always work this way. The Lisp and Smalltalk tradition often blurred the lines between the editor you're using and the project that you're working on. Like there wasn't this firm separation. For example, Dr. Racket, that's the one in the foreground, when you run code in it, it actually runs it on the same runtime that the editor itself is running on, which is pretty mind-blowing. And a lot of these tools work this way. And it gave you such a close connection to your code. You know, it was a very different way of programming. So why are we here writing code like cavemen? And there are a lot of reasons. I suppose one of the reasons is that Java and C# are not really languages that are meant for being malleable at runtime. So this is their world. But we're using a Lisp, we're using Clojure, so why can't we have a tool like these? And so I figured the best way to do it would be to create an editor that you don't install. It ships as a library. You just add it to your project as a dependency, and you run it alongside your project. And for the interface, it can just spin up a little web server inside of your project and serve up a browser-based editor. And so that was the idea. I figured that would take a long time to implement, but something happened. Once again, I'm making it sound ominous. Something happened last fall in the southeastern US. Something that never, as far as I know, never happens in Europe. Does anyone know what I'm thinking of? It's a meteorological event. Yeah. Hurricane. That's right. That's a hurricane. That giant cinnamon swirl there. And I was in Charleston. That's the label at the top. And you know, by this point in time, the whole city was evacuated except for this guy. I stayed behind. And I just bought a bunch of food and beer and just barricaded myself inside my apartment and just decided I would ride it out. And luckily, the storm was pretty weak by the time it got up to Charleston, so I was okay. But the reason I'm telling you this is it gave me over a week of completely free time. Charleston was a ghost town. I had nothing else to do. So I worked on this project, and the end result was Nightlight. Nightlight is exactly what I just described. It's an editor that ships as a library. You don't install it anywhere. You add it to your dependencies, and it will run inside your project and serve up this web-based interface. It looks a lot like Nightcode, actually. And but the big difference is it's running inside of your project in the same exact process. So remember I said code completion. I could never implement code completion in Nightcode. I implemented it in maybe 2 hours when I was working on Nightlight. It was trivial because it's running inside your project. So how do you do code completion? I just go to the namespace that you're editing right now, and I just ask for all the available symbols, and then I display them in the UI. So that, I think, confirms this idea that certain features become trivial to implement if you design your editor in such a way that it runs inside the project. So it has code completion. Another thing that was easy to implement was a built-in REPL. You see that little tab there? There's a little built-in REPL that you just get for free when you launch Nightlight. You don't need to fiddle with any REPL connection or anything like that. Since it's running inside your project, I just basically run the REPL and pipe the input and output to your browser. It's very easy, and you have access, of course, to all the namespaces of your project. And yes, as you can see, there's also support for Clojure script. And as you can see, it shows the REPL, but it also loads up the Clojure script app in an iframe. And so you can interact with it much the same way that you would with normal tools, except I'm sure a lot of you have tried setting up a Clojure script REPL. If you have, you know it sucks. It's really hard. And there's all these different tools that you have to use to do it. I'm going to argue without any evidence that Nightlight is actually the easiest way to set up a Clojure script REPL. And you know, you'll have to try it for yourself to see if I'm right about that, but I think I am. So that's a little bit about Nightlight. If you want to use it, you can use it with boot or with Reimagining. If you want to use boot, you can just add Nightlight to your dependencies. And I actually have a boot task that you can bring in and just compose with your other boot tasks. If you want to use Reimagining, probably the easiest way is to use the plugin Line Nightlight. Shantanu Kumar was nice enough to send that as a pull request. So just add it to your profiles.clj, and then in any Reimagining project, you can just do Line Nightlight. So I will say I'm a huge fan of boot. That's another train that you need to hop on. Okay, boot is great. I mean, Reimagining is very good too, but I think the downside to declarative build tools becomes apparent when you need to do things that they weren't designed to do. Building Clojure script, building an Android app, running Nightlight. Because what do you have to do? You always have to create a plugin for it. You know, there's always line this, line that. And plugins are fine, but they don't really compose together. So normally you have to, you know, run all of these things in separate processes. The beauty of boot is that you can do all of these things in a single JVM process. I regularly create full stack Clojure script apps with boot, and I run my server, I run the Clojure script compiler, and I run Nightlight, like all in one JVM instance, which is pretty badass. So yeah, I definitely recommend looking into it. So that's how to set up Nightlight. I released it, a couple of months went by, and once again I found myself with free time. And that's because I quit my teaching job in December. And I was trying to figure out what to do next, and I realized in a dream one night that I got this browser-based editor that I run locally. Why not go a step further and make a hosted version? You know, these are typically called cloud IDEs. And I did that. And it's available now, or I didn't check to see if it's up right now, but it should be. It's called nightcoders.net. It's free, and the idea is I run Nightlight and all of the build tools on my server. So you don't need to install anything. You don't need Java on your system. I mean, you could create a project with a Chromebook or a I don't know why you would want to use a smartphone, but all you need is a browser because all of the tools are running on my server. So you can, you know, log in like this, create a project. It's only for Clojure script right now. I don't let you do any back-end development because I don't really know how to run arbitrary code safely on my server. That just seems like a bad idea. So for now, it's just for Clojure script projects, but still, it's got a lot of stuff. And when you open up a project, it just looks like this. It's just Nightlight. The only difference is that it's got this new item called Control Panel, and that shows you the build output that's coming from my server, and it also lets you add libraries. So You can add any library, any ClojureScript libraries you want. You have full access to Clojures. So it's not just a toy. You can build pretty sophisticated stuff with it. So that's nightcoders.net, and I don't really know what my plans are for it in the future, but you know, after working on this, I think you can see in general that my projects are all basically moving towards the web. You know, my newer development tools are, and also my game development work. If anyone you know, recalls, my old library is called PlayCLJ. It runs on the JVM. My new game library is called PlayCLJS. And so once again, I've been working a lot more towards you know, ClojureScript and browser-based development, essentially. So please report bugs. That's the face I make when someone reports a bug on one of my projects. But I do appreciate it, though. I need bug reports. Nightcoders.net is actually not open source right now because I'm trying to decide if I want to make it commercial. But Nightlight is open source. You can report bugs there. You can report bugs on my subreddit. You can email me. You can send a carrier pigeon with your bug report on it over the Atlantic. I don't care. You can match me on Tinder and send the bug report through Tinder. I don't care how you do it. But please report bugs. I love bug reports. I do hate bugs, though. Who here hates bugs? Who here hates bugs? That's like almost everybody. No, we all hate bugs, right? That was not a trick question. We all hate bugs. I think I hate bugs for a different reason than you guys do, though. I was thinking about this in a dream one night. I don't hate bugs because they're embarrassing. Like, I don't care about my reputation. And I don't hate bugs because they inconvenience my users. I think it should be clear that I am a psychopath who doesn't care about other people. So why do I hate bugs? I hate bugs because, you know, I was thinking programming is the only skill I have. It's the only thing I've actually invested at least 10,000 hours into. You know, like how many people can say programming is like the only marketable skill you really have? Well, that's embarrassing. It's like 1-2 people raise their hand. All right, so I'm the only one who's screwed right now. Though, you know, that's true. It's because you all are bilingual. That's a skill. No. Programming is the only actual skill I have. And I realized if it turns out I'm not good at it, then that means I'm not good at anything at all. And so every time I get a bug report, I'm thinking to myself, man, Zach, you need to learn how to build things with wood or learn how to cook or something else. But at the same time, like I said, I want bug reports. They're very helpful for my projects, especially my more recent ones, because there's plenty to go around. So, yeah, that's a bit on my regrets. That's my email, if you want it. That's my personal site, and that's me posing as Goose from Top Gun. Dankeschön. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. Are there any questions?
Yes.
You said that you teach programming, maybe programming Clojure. Have you used Nightlight for teaching either kids or
I did.
Clojure Bridge? And what was the response?
Yeah, I did teach one class with Nightlight, and it was like the first version, like right after I released it. So they got to find all of my bugs for me. And as far as how did it go with them? There's one downside to using Nightlight for teaching that I noticed, which is that because it's running inside of your project, if your code is broken to the point where your project doesn't run, well, Nightlight can't run either. And how do you fix it? If Nightlight doesn't run, you got to open up a different editor and fix the bug first. So that is kind of a problem. That's not a problem for nightcoders.net, though. So I think that could be more successful. But yeah, I mean, for beginners, it's really, with Nightcode, it prevents you from having to use or install build tools like Reimagining or boot. Nightlight is almost coming from a different angle. You do have to use Reimagining or boot, but you can have the editor essentially be built into the project, which could be helpful for workshops that need to get up and running fast. So, yeah. Anyone else?
So you mentioned that this editor ships the library. Does it ship as a Clojure library or a Clojure script library?
It's a Clojure library. Well, it's written in Clojure and in Clojure script.
So
But
any chance it could be ported to like a Node type of environment?
Node? Yes, I mean, I would definitely have to rewrite the backend because all the code that starts up a little web server and has various routes for all the editing actions, those would have to be rewritten if you wanted to run it on Node instead. It would be an interesting project. Next time I find myself being hit by a hurricane, I will try that maybe. I don't know. Yeah?
I just wanted to share an idea which came up with your talk. I just wanted to share an idea that came when you did your talk, and it is the possibility to use Nightlight as a kind of very powerful user interface for power users wanting to make change in a large system. So when you are out in the wood and you don't have a own laptop, a own secure way to do an SSH connection and so on, you can just start Nightlight on any browser on a halfway secure machine and describe the changes you want to do in an infrastructure, in a system, in data, as data in Clojure script, which you can build in various ways and then send it over the wire. It was just kind of cool idea that come when you do cool stuff like yours.
Yeah, and that's a good point. And that wasn't even something I thought about initially, but I realized after the fact that you can just run it on a server and access it remotely. As long as that server exposes that port number, you can just hit it from a browser. And I even made a change recently in Nightlight that lets you set up authentication for it. That way you're not just exposing it to the public internet, and anyone who goes there can edit your code. So you can even add authentication now to get some security if you're trying to do remote editing. So yeah, that's something I've definitely thought about.
Are there any plans to support Safari?
Safari?
I really want to use it on my iPad, but the
Does it not work?
The insta-REPL and the REPL are broken.
Ah,
I will file the bug.
Yeah, report the bug. Yeah, no, I had no idea. I mean, I never used Safari, so that's exactly the sort of thing I would never notice. I'm aware that it does not work on Edge. Yeah, that's okay. Yeah, I haven't gotten too many complaints about that yet, but yeah, it's a feature.
The Clojure libraries, like the web server, is it isolated from the application, like with the class loader?
No, and that definitely can cause some problems if there's like a dependency conflict.
Right.
And I guess I haven't really looked into using a separate class loader. That's definitely a good idea. If you want to submit a pull request, I'll totally take it. Well, maybe. But yeah, I know people have run into problems, especially with dependency conflicts, because just like any time you add a library, it can do that. It's just weird when your editor causes dependency conflicts, but yeah.
How long's the tail of dependencies?
Oh boy. I mean, direct dependencies. I mean, Nightlight relies on Ring for the web server, and there might be a few other libraries in there, but Ring is probably the one that will cause the most dependency conflicts, because of course Ring is a pretty big library itself. But that's the one that comes to mind.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
One last question. Okay, looks like we're done. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you.